All right, Dr. Nick, why don't we go ahead and get started? Appreciate everybody joining us this evening to kind of, we're going to go over the emotional regulation and sports performance. So I think many of you, looks like I'm looking at some of the names, look familiar. You might have been on some of Dr. Nick's webinars so far during this 360 program. So, but for those of you that have not, Dr. Nick Molinaro is a sports psychologist, working all kind of areas of sports psychology, and you know, obviously very focused on the sports psychology part of this as well. So looking forward to hearing this tonight. Thanks for joining us. If you have any questions throughout, just drop your questions in the chat room, and we'll do our best to answer them throughout the session. And I know Dr. Nick likes to stop and ask questions, ask if anybody has any questions throughout. So we'll have plenty of opportunity to ask questions and get those answered. And otherwise, take it away, Dr. Nick. And if you guys, if you don't mind, just keep your mics on mute, just for the background noise. If you have any questions, obviously feel free to speak up. But during the presentation, if you can keep it on mute, that'd be great. Dr. Nick, take it away, man.
Nope.
Okay, Matt, thanks very much for this opportunity. And throughout the segment, I do like to have participation. Matt will be helping me out with that. You can send a chat question if you'd like, and we could open mics up as we get through the end of this. So again, please mute your microphones until you're ready to speak. So my background as a sports psychologist here, for those of you who don't know my work, I've been working in the field of sports psychology for about 35 years. And I work with young children of some ages. I start with around 8 years old, and I work all the way up to Olympic and professional level athletes. I've worked with some teams such as Yale's lacrosse team.
Oh yes, he's a great guy.
And I've had a lot of experiences with both men and women in different sports, as you can see on the screen.
Your sister right now stayed outside to play spike ball with you. Like this.
Okay. So here's a kind of an overview of what we're going to be studying tonight. And the reason I talk about the truth about emotions, there's a lot of misunderstandings about what emotions are and the impact that they have on sport. So hopefully by the time we finish this evening, you will understand what emotions are and how they impact performance because of what they're doing to the brain. It's not just what's going on in your mind. We're going to differentiate between the brain and the mind. Where they come from and how they affect performance. What I describe as the truth about performance and how not to rely on feelings or errors in your thinking. So a lot of what you're going to be hearing tonight is based upon cognitive process, which is, if you could mute your mics, that'd be really helpful unless you're speaking with me.
That means the person with the card gets the word house on it for partner.
I'm sorry for the delay. Okay, so the first thing we're going to go through here is an exercise in what you see. We'll take a look at what this is, and I'm assuming that most of you are going to see a square here. Now, some of you have been through the exercise already. Keep your eye on the screen. And you're going to see that there was never a square there in the first place. Frequently, people see the square on top of the circles. Now, the reason I bring this up is for several. One is to describe what truth is. What you see is not always what you get. And the other is to take a look at what we describe as critical thinking. If you use critical thinking here, you would know that this is two-dimensional. The square cannot be on top of the circle. And if you look even closer, there's no lines here that define the square. Now, what a person is seeing and what a person's believing is going to affect their emotional state. The other reason I use this example is when I work with attentional shifting with athletes. If you stay focused on this 1 3/4 circle, and as I bring the other 3/4 circles in, try not to see the square, and most of you will see the square appear immediately. The reason we use this as an example that you become distracted. So even though you know you're not supposed to be seeing something, your distractibility may bring you right back to seeing something. And that's what happens with emotions. Emotions interfere with our ability to make judgments. You'll see when I give you some of the pictures that the first thing that goes away under emotional duress is the ability to analyze data effectively. Critical thinking exercise. Which letter does not belong? Now, I know one of you in the studio, in the audience, knows the answer. You've seen this before, but that's not the reason, because you figured it out immediately. And if you haven't figured it out already, it's a T. Now, some of you may have not seen the T. Some of you may have seen that as a cross. Now, again, the reason that we're looking at this is what happens to the way in which you are perceiving things, or what we would describe as your mindset. The way in which you go into a performance, or the way in which you even think about how well you're going to do, is based pretty much on how you're thinking and also how you're feeling. This is my statement: high-level performers in sport, business, in any competitive arena do not fear failure. They rely on the faith and their ability to perform optimally in every moment of every day. Now, the reason I'm starting off with this is that fear is an emotion. Faith is not. Faith is a belief process, but fear is an emotional state. We want to be able to differentiate between those two effectively when we're looking at performance. Feelings are overrated, and feelings don't always tell us the truth. Now, how is that coming from a psychologist, that feelings are overrated? Well, feelings don't always tell us the truth. I'm sure you've had the experience yourself, or with one of your children maybe, who was in a darkened room. And at some point they became frightened to turn the lights on, the fear went away. Well, there was no truth about what would cause the fear, but it didn't mean they didn't have the fear. That fear felt real. Now, beliefs don't always tell us the truth. That's a problem. Well, if beliefs and feelings don't tell us the truth, what tells us the truth? This is going to be a very brief introduction into confidence. And what I'm going to tell you is confidence is a very poor predictor of performance, contrasting that to what most coaches would say, most parents would say, what most teachers say, and actually what many children believe. It is a very poor predictor of performance, and here's the reason. Is confidence an emotion, or is it a belief? Now, if it's an emotion and it's not telling us the truth, that's a problem. If it's a belief and it's not telling us the truth, we have a bigger problem. So when you look at the definition of confidence, it is your belief or your feelings, your belief and or your feelings in your ability to perform. Now, neither of those are going to tell us the truth. Hopefully by the time we end, I'm going to be able to explain the difference between what truth is and what you are actually imagining what the truth to be, not unlike perhaps seeing the square in the center of those 4 3/4 circles. That wasn't the truth. The square was never there. What you believe and what you might be feeling may not necessarily tell you the truth. And imagine how that might get transmitted to children and performance. What is the best predictor of performance? We're not going to spend a lot of time in this now. If we have time at the end, I'll spend time on talking about grit and what grit actually is, and what's called self-efficacy. Those are the two best predictor of performance under pressure. Try to stay focused on emotional control. We'll talk about those if we have time at the end of this session. What is an emotion? Now, people will talk about this in a simple way or a full description, and you can just read along as I kind of explain what emotions are. By definition, an emotion is felt. Now, there has to be a physiological response, and that gets measured in a number of different things, with galvanic skin responses, heart rate, respiration, perspiration, galvanic skin responses. There are many physiological responses that will tell us a person is feeling something. Now, frequently a person will say, oh, but I feel that way. And when we measure what's going on, they're not feeling it at all. They're thinking it. So part of the problem is, do we really know what an emotion is? What's your experience with emotions? And by definition, it has to be felt. That's why they're called feelings. If it's not felt, it may be a thought. But if you believe it's a feeling, and if you believe that feelings are telling yourself the truth, you're going to be mistaken just because you're thinking about something versus it really being the truth about what you're feeling. How many emotions does a human have? What do you think? Well, we really start off with only two. And the reason that there are only two is that's the way our brain is equipped. And those two are called pleasure and displeasure. Now, every other emotion, and you can look at different research, will say 7, 8, 9 different emotional states. But what you're going to notice is that they're either displeasure or pleasure. There are only those two feelings within the individual. Now, what's the difference between distressed and being angry? You might call that frustration. You might not actually be able to see what those differences are because there's an overlapping. But certainly you can talk about the difference between being angry and being afraid. So some of these are blurring the lines. And so part of the problem is when you ask a person what they're feeling, they sometimes say to you, well, I really can't explain it, or I don't really know. There's a number of things that are going on. Clearly, it can either be a displeasurable experience or a pleasurable one, but it's not both. So when the brain is feeling displeasure or the brain is feeling pleasure, there are very different portions of the brain that are being stimulated. All of these are experienced within the brain. This is an example of a number of different emotional states. And again, depending upon who you read, you're going to see that there are a number of these. People are going to have different perspectives on this. Now, the point is that emotions are neither right or wrong, good or bad. You can describe them as being negative, or you can describe them just as feelings and not qualitate them. You can qualify them if you decide to, but that's going to be your belief. If you're going to look at them as negative or positive versus pleasure or displeasure, you're going to start to bias the interpretation. So let's give an example. How many children do you know who are healthy physically, don't have any anatomical problems, have not learned how to walk? Well, if you've raised children, you know that they're going to fall down. And the interesting thing about kids, before they learn that they should be hurt or upset about what's taking place, is that every time they fall down, they get up again. And they fall down, they get up again, they fall down, they get up again. And every child without any kind of disability learns how to walk in spite of the way other people might react. But if the child falls down and the mother or the father said, oh, did you get hurt? And if the baby's not even talking at that point, and you say, oh, I think you got hurt, you're now starting to train the child to have the experience that if they fall down and if they start to cry and they get attention, now they're learning that there's something that they're going to get, in spite of the fact, if you left them alone, they'd get right back up and they would start walking again. I'm not talking about children actually getting injured and they fall into an object and they get hurt. That's a different story. But the reason I'm explaining this to you is that you can see that there's only two basic emotional states when a child's born. From that, which are the origin, is that all other emotions are now... I'm sorry, can you turn off your microphone, please?
White raisins and cinnamon sugar. Mix it together and fill the hole in the middle. And put a little dab of butter on top of that. And you put water.
Mr. Gershman, you need to turn off your microphone, please.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry. I am learning disabled. I have an attention disorder and I'm dyslexic, and those kinds of things actually take me away from my performance at times. So the point I was making about what goes on with an emotional state is that if you look at just the basic emotions, that there's only two, and then from that come all these other emotional states. What you can see then is that you've actually trained your child to recognize emotions caused by the way in which you have taught them how to do that. Sorry. All emotions are made up by combinations of those. There's a ton of information. I'm going to skip through some of these other explanations of what emotions are and try to help you understand what it actually does to performance and how we're going to be able to change them. Emotions, by definition, are felt experiences. And where the feeling takes place is all feelings, physical feelings, emotional feelings, are generated in the brain. So here's an example of where the amygdala is, and this is where negative emotions are. And from the difference between negative emotions and positive emotions, they're felt in different hemispheres of the brain. So you can't feel them in your brain, like you can't feel the heat of your brain. When your brain is heating up, when you become anxious, and I'll show you a picture of that, you can't feel that heat because you have no heat receptors. However, the emotions which are generated in the brain are triggered by different responses or stimuli, and we're going to look at, do the emotions occur first, or does your thinking occur first? Is intuition an emotion? Is there a difference between a gut response and intuition? Now, most people describe gut responses and intuition as the same process. Well, they're very, very different. Your abdomen, where the gut response actually is, and there's a visceral response there, people will describe as intuition, really isn't. That's literally a gut response. And what actually happens then is that there's a change in what's called the serotonin levels. There's serotonin in your brain. It's responsible for electrical stimulation and being able to modify responses and control emotions. So when a person says a gut response versus intuition, they use them as the same, but I want to help you understand why it's critical to differentiate those two, because intuition is a cognitive process. Here's a good example of what's happening, with the mind. Now, the mind is the function of the brain, just like metabolism is the function of the pancreas. So there's the organ, which is the brain, not unlike the pancreas, and then there is the process of what's taking place, or the function. So the mind is the function of the brain, as metabolism is a function of your pancreas. So what we have control over is our mind. So you hear of the mind-body relationship, or the brain-body, or the mind-brain-body. Your mind can influence your brain, and your brain can influence your mind. So in understanding emotional regulation, we have to understand what is the causality within the individual. The reason I'm going to bring this up right now is that you're going to see as we go forward, when we understand how do we predict who might experience some emotional distress under pressure in sport performance. So there's a study that was conducted and went on for 50 years. The children that were in the study were 4 weeks old, and then he observed these people for the next 50 years, so they're 50 years old when the study was done. At the age of 11 months, we could tell which children would have anxiety and which of those children would probably manifest the anxiety as they got older. So in that form of anxiety, there's a predisposition. You're hardwired. That starts within the brain. Now, other anxiety is taught, and maybe because there was a specific incident, a trauma. But some anxiety is generated in the brain because of lowered thresholds. That's a significant piece when you're trying to help a child regulate their emotions, or even trying to regulate your own. All of those kinds of electrical activities for individuals that have an inborn predisposition for anxiety are present at birth, and then we start to see them being developed. Now, the way parents, teachers, and coaches respond to children that have those predispositions will significantly influence how they're going to function with that anxiety going forward. So understanding that there are controls, but they're subjected to what's gone on physically. Not everybody is you're going to be a pole vaulter. Not everybody's going to be a distance runner or a sprinter, because there's inborn predispositions. So you can train as hard as you want to, but not everybody's going to have the same degree of potential. That's also true of emotions. Most people don't understand that everybody does not have the same emotions. Not everybody has the same potential to experience emotions, because the brain is hardwired for the thresholds, the intensity, and the length of time it's going to take to cross the threshold and come back under control when you want to regulate the emotions. That's my job, is to figure that out and how to teach people to respond more effectively. I'll stop here for a moment and just see if there's any questions so far. Okay, we'll move on. Does physiological arousal precede or follow emotional experience? So here's a question. Was it an emotion, or was it a thought that caused the response? So those of you who have not experienced any of my programs before, what I'd like for you to do right now is to imagine a piece of fruit in your mouth, something very juicy, an orange, a peach, an apple, a piece of steak. Now try to imagine it as clearly as you can. And as you're doing so, you will start to notice that there'll be some saliva that's generated in your mouth. And psychologists have studied the amount of saliva in your mouth when you imagine something juicy, and have studied the amount when there actually is a piece of fruit or food in your mouth. And they're exactly the same. Now, the reason that this is important is that your mind actually tricked your brain into believing that there was actually something there. Now, once that physiological response begins, it'll take you 3 minutes to stop salivating. When a person has an emotional response, they cannot recover very quickly. In my work with athletes, there's a 90-second window of time that they have to recover. If they miss that 90-second window, it'll take them 3 to 7 minutes. Now, imagine a sport where 3 to 7 minutes is a very long time. Golf is not one of those, but hockey is, and basketball, and the open sport is. So we need to be able to control the emotional responses. We have 90 seconds to get it back under control, or teach the person how not to cross the threshold in the first place. So this is a really important question. Is it really a thought, or is it really a feeling? It can only be called a feeling when there's a physiological response that we can actually measure. Are emotions expressions learned, or are they instinctual? First of all, there's nothing instinctual in the human being. Nothing instinctual. Instinct, by definition, is full-blown reactions the first or second time the organism has the experience. Now, human infants are the most helpless of all infants of all species in the world. A baby cannot live on its own. It has to be nurtured. And a lion can, a tiger can, a monkey. I think all but mammals. I think maybe a whale might not be able to. So then, since that's the case, we are hardwired to the predisposition to trigger the emotion, but we're taught what these emotions mean. And we're taught, in the example of the child who's learning to walk and they fall down, and the parent starts to say things like, "Did you get hurt? Are you okay?" The baby can't answer, but the parent said, "Oh, too bad." You're now starting to teach what that emotional response may mean, which might not be an accurate explanation for the individual. Are emotions functional? Absolutely. What would your life be like if you didn't have emotions? You couldn't hear a great piece of music or look at art or hear the words, "I love you." So emotions are important. The question is, are they telling us the truth? They're giving us an experience. So when we work with mindfulness, we'll talk a little bit about how you can use your emotions in mindfulness, but making decisions based upon emotions, that's another question. So the question is always arises, does the emotion come first or does the thought? I just gave you the example of imagining a piece of fruit in your mouth when it wasn't even there, and you thought about it, and then your brain experienced either an image or a past experience, which then triggered the emotional response or the physiological response. Since all emotions are physiological, we're looking for factors that are going to actually influence that. So it may be the look from a parent when a child's at a game. It may be the words of a coach. It may be a thought. Any of those processes may influence the mind, which is going to influence the brain, which is then going to influence the emotion. There's two routes to emotions. So in this example, the event can either trigger an emotional response. A bear jumps out of the woods. I don't think you have to think about the bear. Or you can say, oh, it's dark out and I'm walking into this situation. What should I do now? Here's a question. When stimuli enter the brain, what part of the brain receives the stimuli? The amygdala, hypothalamus, how long does it take for the brain to process the stimuli to go to the cortex for analysis? I wish I could tell you more about the physiology. I really don't know the answer to that. Certainly I can tell you that those areas are being triggered to some extent by pathways that have produced this. So for example, if I said 911 or 911, you might have two different kind of responses. Now you might not have an intense emotional response, or you might have an intense emotional response because the pathway in your brain is being triggered by the stimuli of the way in which you're conceptualizing 911, 911. Years ago, 911 meant the type of Porsche. I drove one. Porsches still are 911, but you won't see them advertised in the Northeast as 911 because of what it represents. So they're called Carreras, and so you see any advertisement in the Northeast about a Porsche, they'll call them Carreras, they won't call them 911, because it will trigger a response. So sorry, I can't answer the exact question that you asked about the speed of which it goes and which way it goes in, but there is a pathway. And the interesting part is that we can change pathways in the brain. So the issue is someone considering what is being experienced, or is there an emotional response? And the answer is there are two routes for emotions to actually start. We could spend a lot of time on gender differences, and so without having a bias towards one gender or the other, the studies have told us actually that females express experience emotions more frequently with more intensity than males do, and they're hardwired to do that. Okay, this is a clear example of the functioning of the brain. So you can see where the stimulus is and the intensity of different emotions in the brain. You see where logic is and emotions occurring in a physiological way. It gets triggered from where these are censoring it and triggers a physiological response. And again, if there's not a physiological response, it's not emotional. It may be a thought. So consider how many times you say, I feel, and see if you're actually feeling that, or if you are constructing that as a result of what you're thinking. We'll spend a little more time on this brain. Now, this study was done by Dr. Debbie Cruz, and Dr. Cruz is a psychologist, and it works at, I think it might be Arizona State. And she's known mostly for her work in golf. But what she did was pioneer the use of a PET scan, positron emission tomography, which measures the heat of the brain. Now you can see on the left side of the brain over here, see how much red that is. This red represents the heat of the brain. It is also on the right side of the brain, and this is where emotions are experienced, and creativity is experienced. So individuals who have low thresholds to stimulation get to this point quicker than people who don't. I couldn't make a universal statement, but certainly I could tell you that most individuals that have low thresholds here who are anxious are typically creative people. And those people are creative because the thresholds are lower, which means it doesn't take as much to stimulate how a person's going to have an experience of an emotion. So if we go back now to the model of which comes first, the thought or the emotional response, this is an interaction, a dynamic one. Now, in addition to having feelings, the first thing that occurs, and this is an example of anxiety, anger, frustration, negative emotions. The first thing that occurs here is that there is a depreciation of the ability to analyze data. It's one of the reasons why students have difficulty on tests in math or science, in spite of the fact that they may have knowledge of it. It also affects literature. Anything that requires analysis can easily be affected by this taking place. So when I prepare students either for SATs, ACTs, or the law boards or medical school, I spend a lot of time getting them to regulate their brain and have this be their process. So as soon as they begin the test, their brain starts to act more like this than this. Now, for an athlete, what actually happens here is that you tense both muscle groups, muscles that are supposed to be relaxing and tensing and doing just the opposite as you come through whatever performance you're doing. So throwing, kicking, running, hitting a golf ball, hitting a baseball, volleyball, all of those will be affected by this degree of anxiety. Now, it might be subtle, but it will affect coordination, it will affect agility, it'll affect strength and speed. So you can see that if we can modify this response, we can get tremendous changes in brain's performance. An average cross-country runner that I'll work with who's in high school will drop about 20 seconds after about 4 hours of training. I had one student who was so anxious that at the end of 4 hours of training, she dropped 50 seconds. So this process of emotional responses based upon thresholds that can be inborn and triggered either by thoughts which are not telling us the truth or a physiological response that the person then spends a lot of time thinking about and doesn't break the cycle. This is a process here which is caused by thinking. As all I can do is teach people how to think differently. I don't prescribe medication. I don't talk about specifics of athletic performance, except in trying to identify where anxiety might actually influence performance. All I can do is teach people to think differently, and that will modify emotional response and physiological responses to increase performance. Now, this is an example of high performance, which you can see on the vertical, and on the horizontal axis, you see arousal and anxiety. And at the top of the screen, you'll see the ZOF, which is called the zone of optimal functioning. And my responsibilities in working with athlete, business individuals, anyone that wants to perform at a higher level, is to try to get the person at this high level and stay there for as long as they can. This is performance from 0 to 100. Well, you can see that the arousal level, as it rises up, so does performance. Now, as anxiety increases, performance drops off. But the interesting thing here is that both arousal and anxiety, high arousal and low anxiety, produce the same high degree of performance. So before every major sporting event, and that might be major for your children, not just the World Series or the Super Bowl, an athlete will experience some degree of anxiety. Now, as long as we can keep it low, their performance will actually be high. If their arousal level is too low, their performance won't be high. If their anxiety is too high, their performance will actually drop off. So this is the narrow area that we try to focus on in getting the athlete to understand, how do we do that? Well, what we like to do, for open sports, those where someone's trying to stop you from doing what you're trying to do, soccer, football, basketball, baseball, that we like to hear a lot of stimulation. So the arousal in an athlete who's an open sport athlete needs that stimulation, goes into the limbic system, auditorily, excites the individual, and performance increases. In closed sports, gymnastics, tennis is both closed and open, serves are closed, you start the serve. And in golf, we need quiet, because that overstimulation will actually impact performance. So If you could mute your microphone, please. So if you can see then that our task then is to keep people right here. And you can imagine now, if I have an athlete that was born with a predisposition to experience anxiety or hardwired, that athlete is going to come into the situation very differently than someone who is not. Okay, I'll pause here for a few seconds. Is there any questions?
Not if it's like a game or call, and so you don't want to be not it, and the other people like, I'm just begging so fast, please, and not it.
No questions? Okay. Now I'm going to show you this test, and this is the test that I'm using and actually doing a 4-week session on the interpretation of this and the impact that this has on performance. And so one of the things you can see is that there are scores here for anxiety, there's scores here for anger, there's scores here for self-critical. Now, when I look at individuals that have low scores like this, I'm less concerned that their anxiety or anger or frustration is going to influence their performance. This test is very effective in predicting this. It's used in the NFL, the PGA, the NHL. It's used by the Navy SEALs, and Fortune 500 business execs. So we can tell which individuals are going to be more prone to having those qualities under pressure. Once we're able to identify them, then we set up a very specific treatment program about how to modify those. So I wanted to help you understand that my work is data-driven, so we can see before and after performances by identifying these, setting up goals, and then being able to modify them. Clearly, you can see that we would be identifying at least 2 to 3 different emotional states, and then we would find that those emotional states actually will affect things like the ability to analyze data, the ability to make very quick decisions. Low scores mean quick decisions. The ability to be open-minded. So these 3 scores I've identified will profoundly influence the rest of performance if they're not effectively managed. We're now going to get into the portion of the presentation to talk about how change is going to take place. Now, there's only several factors that influence change. One is maturation. You can't ride a bike if you're 2 days old. So you have to be mature enough, both in a physical sense and obviously in a mental sense, to be able to perform change of the task that you're doing. Coercion. We're all experiencing some of that right now with COVID-19. It's very close to martial law. We have to do things that we don't want to do, and we're being kind of forced into that situation because it has become a law. And many people are not doing well because of this experience of feeling very helpless because you have no control. Crisis can precipitate a change. Certainly 9/11 and COVID-19 has changed the way that we look at things. It's changed the way we're looking at our freedom. And even 9/11 caused us to become more cautious about terrorism, and we started to experience travel in a very different way. So these 3 things, which are outside of our control, can influence our changes in behavior pretty powerfully. Now, discomfort, you don't have complete control over, but sometimes people like to make themselves feel more uncomfortable so their performance would get higher. So people that are very hard on themselves and say sometimes negative thoughts, they actually believe that that's going to increase their performance. It doesn't. Some degree of discomfort is essential. If you're too comfortable, you won't change. If you're too uncomfortable, you won't change. So if I'm working with people that are in a level of discomfort, I have to either reduce the amount of discomfort that they're in, reduce the anxiety, or add a greater challenge that'll make things even more stressful. The high-level performers like to be in a position of being under pressure and stressed. And the last one is the act of the will. And in this situation, it is a decision that you make that you want to modify responses, and that is caused by choice. So I'll give you a few moments before I go on. If there are any questions. Part of what we're going to be dealing with is, cognitive restructuring, which is the way in which you think about things. And what we're looking at here is my model of what's called the line of behavioral congruence. You can know something and not understand it. You can know something and understand it. It's possible to know things. What about your child? Do they really know how to play the sport? Do they know how to control their emotions? Maybe they know it, but maybe they don't understand it. You can understand things that you don't believe. You can understand things that you believe. You can believe things that are not true. You can believe the truth, such as confidence is not the best predictor of performance. It's not true. You can either value the truth or not value it, and then you obviously have the option to exercise that by your application. If I want to know what a person believes, so if I'm working with an athlete and I see that frustration, anger, anxiety is influencing them, there's something that they're believing that's causing them to have that experience. And it might be based upon a value that if they're not winning, they're not playing at their highest level. Now, high-level performance doesn't have to do with winning. Winning has to do with high-level performance. So when I work with an athlete, after I see their patterns or behaviors, I can go back and start to look at what they're believing. So people that might be frightened just because they've learned to be frightened, not because there's anything to be really frightened of, they need to change their belief. So you can see this is an arduous task, but it's very methodical. All I have to do is observe patterns of behavior and then be able to change that. Part of what I do is make sure that every athlete will set up a series of goals and performance objectives. And what we start out here is with intention. So those of you who have heard this before, some of you have not, that you can read a paragraph and after you've read the paragraph, not remember anything that you've read. If I ask you to read a new paragraph with the intention of finding the two most important points, you would read that differently. So in spite of the fact that you actually believe that when you're reading, you're going to learn that, if the intention isn't where your attention needs to be, your performance will actually be affected. So if the intention is to regulate emotions, we need the attention to be in how to regulate your breathing. Your heart rhythm actually affects your brain rhythm. Most people don't know that. So when we do breathing exercises, it's not just to make the person relax, it's to change brain functioning. Heart rhythm affects brain rhythm, not heart rate, heart rhythm. So we need then to have the athlete focus on the appropriate portion of their body and of their mind in order to make effective decisions, which will then eventually affect their behavior. We're going to use stress here in a simple definition. Stress is anything that moves the individual away from equilibrium. Obviously, COVID-19 is changing us. Stress is cumulative and progressive. 1 and 1 doesn't equal 2. So if we're looking at stress factors that might influence anxiety or anger or frustration, you can use that and see that it will accumulate, not unlike the straw that broke the camel's back. The human has 80,000 thoughts a day, somewhere between 2,500 to 3,000 thoughts an hour. Individuals that are experiencing stress as a result of the way in which they're thinking are reviewing over and over in their mind things which may not be true, and they may actually start to believe it. So you can see that there's a high correlation between thinking and what's going on with your brain. Stress suppresses immunological systems, so athletes sometimes are having a hard time getting back into a sport after an injury because the stress is actually influencing perhaps part of the rehabilitation. So I've done, and you'll see some work when I show you the brain on hypnosis, that we can actually influence healing by influencing blood flow. Stress and the suppression or the modification of stress can also affect your immunological system. Here are some examples of how we're going to manage stress. The first line of the stress is to manage the environment. So if your athlete is having stress, and here's a good example, an athlete was an excellent soccer player. She was a junior in college, a junior in high school, and she kept getting soft tissue injuries. And when I started working with her, I started having her explain to me that she was extremely anxious. And she explained to me that she didn't want to play soccer anymore. Her father wanted her to continue. He believed she was a great soccer player. Question is, she may have actually peaked a little bit early. And as a result of playing soccer when she didn't want to, she wasn't planting her foot effectively, wasn't making really good cutting actions, and she kept getting injured. And I actually believe that that was based upon the way she was thinking about how she didn't want to be on the field. Attentional shifting. So you cannot have a positive thought and a negative thought at the same time. You cannot have a negative thought and a positive image. When we shift your attention, your performance will change, your brain will actually change. In the example of imagining a piece of fruit, you created an image which actually produced the modification in your physiological response. If we can change those images of negative thoughts to positive images, we will be able to modify emotional responses. Cognitive restructuring. This is the example that your beliefs and feelings don't tell you the truth. So I'll say to athletes who have some fears of things, just because you think it doesn't make it true. Just because you feel it doesn't make it true. Just because you believe it doesn't make it true. We can actually change thoughts. So in the example of you're seeing the square, which wasn't there, you may have believed it. You would have to change your mind about that. And similarly, when you looked at the letters and you questioned about which one belonged there, it was able to help you change the way in which you think by being able to see the T there and not being seen as a cross. Competing images. You can't have a negative thought, positive image already said. Rational disputation. If a baseball batter was up 2 times and hit successfully 1 time, his batting average would be 500. New batter, he's up 2,000 times, hit successfully 1,000 times. His batting average is still 500. Now the first player who was only up 2 times, the next time he gets up, he won't be batting 500. He'll either go 1 for 3, 333, or 2 for 3, which will be 666. But the second batter, who is up 1,000 times, if he's up 1,000, 2,001 times, and he hits successfully 1,000, his batting average won't change very much. In rational disputation, I will explain to individuals, the probability is so high about your performance, we can look this over statistically. Then why are you paying attention to what you think could happen? So rational disputation is thinking differently. Mindfulness is your ability to use your sensory mechanisms by bringing in comforting experiences, stimulation, music or vision or even touch, relaxation techniques we might actually get to today. Very quickly, I want to go through this. Parents who are in a position of always being responsible for your children to model your behaviors. So in the example of the baby who tries to walk, who falls down, and the parent says, "Did you get hurt?" And the baby can't even answer, you're starting to train them that when you fall down, maybe I get hurt. And a child who has low threshold of stimulation is going to experience that very differently. We want to make sure that we're demonstrating clear thinking, things that are true, not things that you might believe. Things that are true, not necessarily things that you feel. Things that are true, not your projection of what you think your child is feeling. Truth is important. We started with that at the beginning of this session. I'll speak for 5 more minutes and then give you some time to ask questions. There's a lot of data here. I would highly, highly, highly recommend The Obstacle is the Way. And if you haven't read it, it's a very interesting thought that things that produce adversity, which move people away, is actually seen as the opportunity to learn and to challenge those kinds of obstacles. If you imagine a magnet, and like pole magnets attract and opposites repel. In the model of The Obstacle is the Way, the closer you get to something that is repelling you, the greater is the pressure to push you away. However, if you modify your perspective of this and see this as a great opportunity to move towards and move through, that's what the premise of this book is based on. There are some great adages here. I highly, highly recommend this book. all based upon choice. Being in the moment, it would take me a little while to explain that. Let me now go over some examples of why I use hypnosis. Now, people think hypnosis is one of those kinds of weird things you see on TV. Some of you may have been hypnotized by hypnotists. And in clinical hypnosis, it's very, very different. Here is an example where physically induced pain is occurring in the brain. And here is hypnotically induced brain pain. You can see that we can actually replicate pain experiences in the brain by using hypnosis. Now, hypnosis is a natural state. It's not what you see on TV of, the watch swinging or looking at a swirling object. What we know is that women who are in cesarean sections lose less blood when they use hypnosis and medication than just using anesthesia alone. So that the power of the mind and the brain is huge. That's why we can influence blood flow to different portions of the body, after some injuries are taken. So I just wanted you to be able to see that that's the truth. Just some examples again. Here's anesthesia, here's the hypnotic state, and here's the normal waking state. And look how quiet the brain is just by using hypnosis, not unlike what's actually happening with anesthesia. Can you block pain? Yes. You can literally block some pain by using your mind. So if your mind has the ability to modify pain responses, imagine what it can do to your emotional state. They're all based upon your brain anyway. This is an example we might describe it as meditation. It's also seen as prayer. And here is the baseline. And so what we can see is that there is a heightening of some areas of the brain, which is allowing for greater focus, and also then moving away from things that are not relevant. So there are great studies in the use of hypnosis, actually in prayer, and the impact upon performance. I'm not going to go through the breathing exercise. Let me just talk briefly about journaling, and then I'll give you an opportunity. All my athletes, I suggest that they keep a journal. And it turns out to be what is called the Journal of Helpful Thoughts. And from that are things that I discuss with them. Some of them are from their own experiences and discovery about things that might be beneficial for them. I ask them to keep track, of the number of negative thoughts that they might have for a certain period of time. The research is very clear. We can reduce negative thinking by 50% within 2 weeks. So if you have an athlete who is anxious and is based upon a lot of negative thoughts, there are ways to modify that in a relatively short period of time. It's not the same thing about performance under pressure. That would take a little bit longer. But the example I'm having here is that writing is a very, very effective way to learn the processes of what I teach. Okay, I will give you some time to ask me some questions.
Dr. Nick, I got something for you. So, it's not often that, whether we're talking to athletes or, professionals or, maybe just students, that you get a chance to really kind of reflect on the mental side of things and proper planning and educating yourself in that way. As athletes, we're always, I'll use baseball as a reference. I coach baseball, but we're always, it's an hour practice. You got to get through a lot of things. You're constantly working on your craft or whatever it may be. It's very, very few times do you have the opportunity to talk about, your approach or developing a routine or changing kind of or enhancing your mental capacity. So, for those that, we can try and see this, current situation with kind of being at home and as an opportunity to improve our mental situation, your mental capacity. For those that are interested in diving into that, what's a good follow-up to this discussion? I mean, you give us a lot of good information and, a lot of good facts about, emotional regulation, but kind of what's next? If you're an athlete, if you're an adult, you're a career professional, like what would you suggest people do from here with this information?
Well, clearly I'm available if I can be of any help, of course. But what I would say is that we want to use techniques, particularly now when kids have modified schedules of their schooling and they're not actually performing their athletics because of what's going on. So here's a great opportunity to use imagery. So imagery gets confused as being able to see where the ball's going to go versus what it is that you do in order to hit the shot. The presidential candidate, John McCain, used imagery for 4 years when he was a prisoner of war, playing golf every day. He spent 4 hours in his mind walking the golf course. He just imagined what the shots would be like and what he would actually feel when he was doing this. And the story goes that after he warmed up from coming out of prisoner of war camp, he shot like an 84. So the things that I could say that there are great processes like imagery, things that you can imagine feeling. You can imagine feeling running down a flight of steps right now, and you might feel a sensation in your body. You can imagine running down a flight of steps using the opposite foot. So imagination, this is a great opportunity to work with individuals around imagery.
Great, thank you.
Can I ask you, you said to reduce negative thinking in 2 weeks to journaling. What are some of the favorite areas that you like people to journal about? Like what aspects of journaling do you find most helpful?
Well, first of all, it's to identify what it is they want to be able to achieve. So, setting a goal about really what you would like to be able to do is to journal about that. And then to identify the very specific performances that you need to change. And that comes from either the coach who's actually instructing you about what you need to change. So let's take an example. What sport are you looking at?
I'm looking at lacrosse.
Okay. I've had a lot of experience with lacrosse, having worked with the Els team. So in lacrosse, what we'd be looking at is what factors will produce pressure or stress. Is it when there's one man down? Is it if the person's doing face-off, if they're on attack? What are the factors that actually produce stress or actually produce some apprehension? So we need to identify different emotional states. I'd like for them to journal about that. I'd like for them to journal at the end what their experience was about their own performance. So on a scale of 1 to 10, we use FE, focused effort. And individuals that are performing at a high level are focusing for longer periods of time than individuals who are not. Now, the human span of concentration is only 10 minutes, so we don't expect them to do that during the entire game. But when you evaluate things like focus, you'll see that that's what's going to direct your attention. So let's go back to the 4 3/4 circles in a white space. We want them to be able to identify when they should have shifted their attention, attentional shifting, and how much energy or how effective were they in being focused on being able to shift their attention. So if they're on attack or midi or they're playing defense or goalie, we want to know what they were doing, what physical responses they had to have, and what was their focus effort during, let's say, the most of the game. That would be an example. And also to list the number of thoughts prior to the game beginning, midway through, and at the end. So we should have a journal of thoughts as well.
Thank you.
There's a question I have here. Can you self-hypnotize? Are there best practices of meditation or mindfulness? So yes, all hypnosis is self-hypnosis. So although I'm instructing the person about hypnosis, I'm not actually hypnotizing them, they're hypnotizing themselves. So I can't make a suggestion that a person will follow if it's against their basic value system. So all a hypnotist does is be able to instruct how to do, in your explanation, mindfulness, meditation, relaxation, is how to do that. Now, trances are common states. We be in trances more often than not, except that we're being bombarded by information. So trances are natural to the human. Yes, all hypnosis is self-hypnosis. You can be taught, and there is a best practice that I believe in. It'd be too long to explain my induction process. I see that as a best practice. Thank you for your question.
In a sport like tennis,
Yep.
what tips would you have for reducing anxiety?
Okay, so are we talking about a serve or are we talking about a volley?
Like just in general,
Okay.
during a match.
All right, well, so what I would have to do is find out when you start to feel anxiety. Do you start to feel it when you get to the court? You start to feel it when there's the first serve. And so what we do is we would identify the very specific aspect of your performance that you become anxious about, and then create an image that's going to be the opposite. So I was speaking with an athlete who had concerns about their second serve. And so the attention would be on your second serve. What you would do is become relaxed, which is the opposite of what you would feel if you are concerned that you would fault again. So we train you to have images of not where the ball's going, but what your body's feeling when you're making that serve effectively. So for example, you saw in the picture of the brain that's anxious that both muscle groups are tensing up, and that's what's causing, the agility and the ability to hit the ball the way you need to. So we need to be able to focus on what does it look like to have a relaxed serve. So that would be what's called external imagery. What would a video camera see if you were serving it effectively? Internal imagery, what it would be like if you're actually serving and you're seeing the toss. That's from behind your eyes, and proprioception imagery is imagining what it feels like. So we'd use one of those three, depending upon the area that's producing anxiety.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Being at home now, what are the recommendations for reducing anxiety? It looks like it's meditation. Reducing anxiety through meditation. Maybe that's what it is. So, and through meditation, thank you. So, in order to enter a meditative state, we're altering our level of consciousness. So I'm sure you've had the experience at times when you've had a dream, and when you've awakened, the dream felt real. It didn't feel like a dream, it actually felt like it took place. That's an altered state of consciousness, not unlike what happens in meditation and hypnosis. Now, the best way to get into that, again, my best practice, is to begin with diaphragmatic breathing. Now, diaphragmatic breathing is in your diaphragm just below your rib cage, not in your thoracic area. Don't do deep breathing. Whoever tells you to do deep breathing, do not do that. And don't breathe through your thoracic area. It produces more tension in your body. If you breathe down here, you'll see that just a small section of my abdomen is actually being inflated. So you breathe in, you hold your breath, you breathe out, relax different portions of your body, and don't breathe. Now it's called square breathing because each of those four components is the same length of time. Now, as you're doing that, you're reducing different muscle groups, you eventually have the opportunity to suggest to yourself a very pleasant image. And just as you had the experience of imagining something juicy in your mouth, your brain and body will start to react to that soothing image. I like to use music when I do hypnosis. Most times I use music in the background. Frequently it's sounds of waves. People like the ocean. So I would use music in your meditation as well. Any other questions? Oh. Could I show the parent slide again? Yes, I will do that. Assuming that muscle memory is etched into our brain circuits as a result of, say, 50,000 successful serves, why then would double fault occur when conditions? Well, so here's the answer to that. There's no such thing as muscle memory. Let me take you back to showing you why that's not the truth. So the reason for this is because there's no such thing as muscle memory. If there was, if you cut off your head, how much would you really actually remember? So. Sorry, I don't have the slide with me. But first of all, I would tell you that the reason for that taking place is that your mind doesn't forget things. And you might forget, you might have had the experience with double faults before or tensing up. And that's a memory thing, which you're now going to try to utilize the experience of muscles having memory in them. That doesn't happen. All of that is occurring in your brain. That's the reason why people like myself are helping high-performing athletes, because it has nothing to do with muscle memory. It has all to do with the pathways in your brain that you can actually influence. I gave you several examples of that, so we're going to stay away from that. These are some examples of what I use to identify what's called coherence. When I work with an athlete, there are a couple different pieces of apparatus that would actually help us understand what's going on with respirations, heart rate, and blood pressure. And how we're going to modify that by giving suggestions. So even in this example of muscle memory, why would that be a problem if the wind picks up? Is because you may have trained your brain, not unlike the explanation of 9/11 producing a different response in it. And I think somebody wanted to see the parent slide. Now, I'm going to talk briefly about understanding that if your child is experiencing anxiety, and if you say, well, that's nothing to be anxious about, you're going to deny their feelings, or you shouldn't be angry about that. If you don't reflect understanding, your child will have difficulty in being able to bond more closely. Understanding is primary in being able to influence others. So as a psychologist, any of you are coaches, parents, understanding is essential. You cannot teach effectively unless you understand what the individual doesn't know. And when you reflect understanding, children will bond closely. Anyone will bond more closely if they're feeling understood. Was there a comment that you wanted to make about this? Well, can you read to practice proper breathing? The relaxation response is a really good one. Could you please show the square breathing and being in the moment slides? Okie dokie. Okay, inhaling, and this is to the count of 4. Now, depending upon how quickly you count to 4, but you notice that this is called square because the 4 sides of the square are all being held to the same count, let's say of 4. Now, if you're doing this again with your diaphragm, not belly breathing and not thoracic breathing, those of you who have children, at some point when they were very young, you would walk into the nursery, make sure their belly was going up and down because their chest area wasn't strong enough. I mean, the lungs weren't strong enough. The diaphragm wasn't strong enough to do this. The diaphragm is strong. Diaphragm is the reason why we're doing it, not the thoracic area. So this is a very simple explanation. Breathe in through your nose, inflate your diaphragm. Imagine there's a balloon there. Hold your breath. As you're relaxing, breathing out through your mouth, relax different portions of your body, and then don't breathe. Square breathing. Post-op knee surgery. How do you get past favoring the good leg to protect the recovery leg? Great question. I've been through this. I had a baseball player, Division I, who was playing left field. He injured his meniscus running to his right. So right after he was allowed to go back and play, he could run very quickly to his left and not to his right, because he was inhibiting it. And so part of that experience in the brain is we have to retrain that. And we can retrain that. I retrained it through hypnosis with him. We can retrain that by every time you start to move to your right actually relax your muscles. And continue practicing this even when you're not on the field. Your brain can't tell the difference, you can see, between what's true and what's not, in the example of the piece of fruit in your mouth. So that's the best way to get there. Is this the same breathing technique that the Navy SEALs use? Yes, it is. And the test that I showed you before is also used with the Navy SEALs. The process, I'm anxious about my tennis return to serve. Could you go back over the thought process if I'm anxious about my tennis return of serve? Okay, so if it's the return, then what we want you to imagine is the ball coming to you. And obviously this happens very quickly, but you can do this in slow motion. See the ball coming to you and do your breathing exercises and allow yourself to see the closer the ball is coming, the more relaxed your body is. Now, relaxation doesn't mean that you're not quick. It doesn't mean that you're not strong. It doesn't mean that you're not agile. It's just the opposite. So we want you to be fluid. So you can literally train yourself from the image of the ball coming to you, being able to meet it with your racket, whatever you're focused on, whatever your coach is telling you to do. And that the closer the ball comes, the more relaxed you are. Now, we do that in slow motion. We increase the speed of that until the ball's coming you at the same rate, but you're still feeling your body relaxed. Now, what you would be doing was that you would be trained in being relaxed before the serve is given. And this way we'd be able to do what's called the prevention before the serve, and then the intervention, what was occurring when the slow motion ball was coming towards you, and imagining your body getting relaxed the closer it comes. Okay. Any other questions? We are sometimes competing on obstacles we haven't practiced on. How can you use imagery to help with anxiety that occurs when faced with an obstacle like this? Well, first of all, I would use thinking because you're going to prepare yourself before you get there. Clearly, you know that you're going to see obstacles that you've not seen before. Why would that obstacle be any different? The way in which you're going to attack it? Well, you can create very many images in your mind and try to rehearse this ahead of time. And then try to either rehearse the difference in terms of sequence or the height of the object or the width of it or whatever the object actually is, and vary different objects each time you do that. You might be able to do that by getting a couple of different cards of different types of objects and being able to flash that and being able to imagine yourself being in control and being relaxed ahead of time. That's what I would suggest. Okay, any other questions? Thank you very much.
All right, thanks a lot, Dr. Nick.
And thanks for listening.
All right, everybody. Hope you all have a nice evening. Thanks again. Stay tuned for Dr. Nick's next session. We'll keep you all posted. Take care.